Welcome back to the Gaming Graveyard. Today we'll be talking about Concord. Concord is more familiar to many as the PlayStation game that was shut down just a week after launch. But for others, it was actually something they enjoyed. It wasn't a massive multi-million-dollar disaster in their eyes. It was something that was truly special. It replaced the feeling that Overwatch was just unwilling to fulfill for so many years now. So how could two completely different opinions be pulled from such a simple game like Concord? Well, let's start by just going through its history. Let's discuss the 5v5 hero shooter that was dubbed PlayStation's future. Our story begins in 2018, where a little-known company known as Probably Monsters founded a subsidiary developmental team, Firewalk Studios. Firewalk Studios had mainly pulled from Bungie to make up their workforce. The studio quickly expanded as they had greenlit their first ever game into pre-production. It would be a 5v5 hero shooter pulling from games like Overwatch and Valorant. They also aimed to do better than those games. They wanted to push the genre forward, redefine what a 5v5 hero shooter could be. And at this point, the game was basically completely fresh. They had no idea how they were going to redefine a hero shooter, they just knew they wanted to. And because they went relatively dark into pre-production and in early development of the game, we really don't know what happened at this point in the studio. All we know for sure is that a toxic positive work environment was being built inside of it. Basically meaning Firewalk was considering all ideas as a good idea and they were running with them in the game. And although when you're brainstorming an idea, this is a really solid way of getting off the blank sheets, but when you're trying to build an entire video game with tons of staff, taking all ideas and considering them as a good idea is just going to slow you down considerably. And it very much so slowed them down considerably. From about 2018 with the founding of the studio to about 2020, the game was completely dark, the studio was completely dark, and progress on the game was unbelievably slow. Despite this slow progress heading into 2021, Probably Monsters and Firewalk Studios were looking for a publishing partner to publish this unannounced game. Pretty quickly, they found Sony Entertainment, who around this time was looking to expand its games as a service model. They had been pretty unexistent in this growing sphere for quite some time, and they finally wanted to break in. And this is one of the first signs that Concord was not going to be very successful. It was now going to be restricted to just the PlayStation and the PC, cutting off at least 20 million players from possibly playing the game. It also doesn't help that Sony's fanbase isn't particularly interested in live service titles, and they've been mostly accustomed to single-player story mode games. So Firewalk was going to have a lot of convincing to do to get Sony's player base on board. From 2021, when Sony officially got involved in a publishing agreement with Firewalk and Probably Monsters, to around 2023, there really was no news. They were developing the game, they were fleshing it out, and they were building its identity, but they didn't really want to reveal it yet as it just simply wasn't ready. But in 2023, more specifically April 2023, Sony would finally have some news about this new shiny game that they would be publishing. Or I guess the studio that was developing the game, as they just straight up acquired Firewalk Studios for an undisclosed amount before the game had even been revealed yet. The acquisition of Firewalk to this day is just so random. We don't know how much they bought them for, but we know it was quite a bit of cash. We don't know why they purchased the studio because they're completely unproven with no IP backing outside of the game that they're making now. It was random. It was just random, and we don't know why. It was stupid, and now it put a lot of pressure under Firewalk because if their first ever game failed, their parent company isn't gonna be so happy. Shortly after acquiring the studio, heading into May 2023, Sony would officially reveal the game with a CGI trailer. It was supposed to remind you of the good old days of the Overwatch cinematic trailers leading up to Overwatch's release. Memories that hero shooter fans remember quite fondly. Unfortunately, for a multitude of reasons, this trailer was very poorly received. One of the major reasons that nobody really liked this trailer was they really didn't know what they were watching. It was a completely unannounced game that they were just randomly shown with a random CGI trailer with absolutely no explanation at all except for the fact that it was a hero shooter. The trailer itself was pretty bare bones. They were clearly going for some sort of Guardians of the Galaxy thing, but they were really never able to figure it out. Pretty much as soon as this trailer dropped, you had two sides of the hero shooter fanbase. One just wrote it off immediately, oh, that's an Overwatch clone, and moved on. The other half was eagerly awaiting to see what kind of information Concord would reveal following this trailer. That's obviously a big shame for Concord, mainly because one of the largest hero shooter fan bases has already just wrote you off as a clone of their favorite game. So what did Sony do to try and bring back this other 50% of the player base and get the other 50% interested in Concord? Nothing. They did nothing. Sony didn't really say much about the game afterwards. The game kind of just went dark for a little while. From what I can gather and from what I researched and found, Concord most likely went dark because the game from this point was about halfway through its development and still had a long way to go. They were putting everything into their next trailer, which would be the gameplay reveal, one of the most important trailers for any game, especially this early when fans are already kind of writing you off. Sony needed that gameplay reveal trailer to prove that fan base wrong, because Sony had reportedly spent at this point anywhere from $300 to $400 million on Concord's development. Heading into May 2024, Concord would officially reveal its first ever gameplay trailer. The gameplay trailer was, let's just say, not all that well received. Pretty much everybody just wrote it off once again as either an Overwatch clone or just an uninteresting game that's gonna die in a few weeks anyway because it's free to play. And then people realized something. Concord isn't free to play. Unlike all of its competition, Concord decided to switch it up, and it would cost players $40 at launch in order to get into the game, which is just a very steep asking price, especially for an audience that was already writing you off. Now to add on top of it, you're going to charge them to play the game when they could just play Overwatch for free or Valorant for free. Things are just spiraling quickly for Concord, and Sony had to do something, right? Well, no. Sony just kind of kept trucking along, despite the constant complaints that were just coming through, and some of them being completely stupid, like we have pronouns on a robot, which who the fuck cares, and then others being that the gameplay looks boring, which is a reasonable argument. Sony just addressed nothing. They said, no, it's really not our problem. Buy the game or don't buy the game. That was kind of just the mentality, it seemed. And it also seemed like the mentality was being encouraged by the fact that they had a beta set to go live in just a couple months in July. And heading into that beta, hype was relatively dead, but Sony was still at least optimistic, it seemed. That optimism probably quickly faded away when Sony looked up reviews for Concord, or at least their Concord's beta, and they realized nothing. There's nothing there. No one played the beta, just a couple content creators to make fun of the game and pretty much nobody else. It was dubbed a generic hero shooter. Nobody even bothered to download it, and it was free to play. Seeing how the beta only had a peak of about 2,000 players, many just predicted Sony may delay the game and completely revamp it from the ground up, try to salvage whatever they were building at Firewalk. But Sony said no. They declared that that August release date that had been set in stone just a few months ago, that was gonna be the release date. Concord was coming out, whether it failed or not. They were gonna see what happens. Heading into the release date, you probably know what's gonna happen. Just a month after the beta, Concord would officially release at the big old fat $40 price tag in a genre where most of its competition was completely free of charge. Speaking of free of charge, you remember how that free of charge beta only had a peak of 2,000 players at the most? Yeah, well, when you charge somebody $40 for a game only 2,000 people were willing to play for free, you can't really expect that many people to pay for it. And that's exactly what happened. At release, Concord had a peak of 700 players, which quickly, and I mean quickly, dropped to just about 300 players playing. Normally, this is the part where I tell you it got ripped apart by fans and critics for being a horrible, disastrous game that was rushed out the door. But in this case, that's not what I'm going to tell you. Concord at launch received very respectable reviews from pretty much every review outlet, and even receiving one of its best reviews from IGN, which, although isn't that surprising, is still pretty solid. Pretty much all of the reviewers just claimed the game wasn't bad, it just was crippling itself with a massive $40 price tag, and refusing to separate itself from its competition in a proper way. Some criticized the game by saying it had poor maps. Others praised the game for its really cool art style and the maps looking really cool. It was a back and forth pretty much throughout this entire period. One side that liked the game would say one thing, the other side would say something else completely different, which is kind of normal because obviously everybody has their own opinion on games, everyone has their own consensus on games, but pretty much only one thing was for sure. Those characters were fucking ugly. Everyone could agree, everyone hated them. And at least we can agree on one thing. I went back and looked at tons of hate videos on Concord, and one thing I noticed is a lot of the hate came from one specific audience. It was the people that never even really played the game, but immediately when they seen it, they go, "Oh, pronoun, me no like 'cause it woke." And then they write it off and they move on. AKA your Asmon stans, or whatever Asmongold calls his fanbase. The fucking forever Trumpers who turn off their brain and just go, "Whoa, woke, me, no, like." I think it's stupid. I think if you're basing your entire opinion off of some random politician that you don't know that doesn't care about you, it's kind of stupid, no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on. But hey, I'm not going to go into it because I have plenty of videos discussing my opinion on this, so just go watch those and you'll kind of get my opinion and my views. Outside of Concord just being unbelievably generic and boring for one side, I do truly believe that's another reason it just completely flopped. 50% of the world just refused to buy it because they don't support your political beliefs and what you put into the game, which is sometimes valid. Other times you've got this.
Nobody here has any kind of sex appeal whatsoever, and of course, thank God there's not a single white person here.
Or this.
A singular attractive character that's female in this game.
And those ones kind of just make no sense. After launch and this disastrous political back and forth and mumbo jumbo and the absolute disaster that was going around this game, Sony came out just a week after launch and said, "Hey guys, we're done. we're out of here. We're packing it up. It's really not our problem anymore." And they announced that despite the loyal fan base and the support around the game, which I'm not sure that's true, that they were going to be unfortunately handing out full refunds of the game and moving on. Which is a nice sigh of relief because they actually offered refunds, but it is a shame that the game only got exactly a week to figure it out. But hey, maybe Firewalk got to live. Oh, wait, nope, never mind. They're dead too. Sony basically purchased Firewalk, forced them to fail, and then moved on. And that was kind of the history of Firewalk. Although I think Firewalk themselves was a fundamentally flawed studio, I do think they had a lot of promise as ex-Bungie developers if they had the right leadership. And I just never thought that Sony gave them the proper leadership to help them actually release a game that could be successful. Even after this disastrous first release in the live service market, Sony has continued to commit to the fact that they're going to release more, even acquiring Bungie for some reason, which is a whole nother story, and I bet Bungie's next game is going to end up on this very show because it's a disaster behind the scenes at the moment. And hopefully they can figure it out because I really do wish Bungie would release literally anything other than Destiny. Fucking hell. Concord in the end was a $400 million disaster that just never really had a chance. Between Sony's audience not really wanting to play live service games and Firewalk themselves being acquired and basically being pressured to make the greatest game of all time, otherwise they'd be fired, it was bound to fail, and it failed. There's nothing else really to it. If you know any more gaming disasters that you want me to cover, please leave them in the comment section down below. And please, for the love of God, Sony and Xbox and Nintendo, which fuck Nintendo for other reasons that I just posted a video about, stop buying studios to shut them down.